Hello. Good afternoon, Britain. Now, The Telegraph has revealed the British Museum is holding private discussions with 4 foreign governments about, guess what, returning items in its collection.
Yes, it seems to be the only museum in the world that's really wanting to give things away rather than, you know, collecting things. But the document shows that since 2015, the museum has received 12 separate requests to hand back items.
Well, the museum didn't reveal any details about which specific objects or which specific countries were involved, but added the communications were ongoing.
Let's speak to the historian and broadcaster Rafe Heydel-Mankoo now, who can join us to talk about this more deeply. Because, Rafe, I struggle with this subject, because if you think about any museum anywhere in the world that is collecting objects that didn't originate in that precise spot, is that bad?
Of course it's not bad. I mean, the important point to note here is that the British Museum is what we call an encyclopaedic museum, and that covers the entire globe. And there are really only 3 of these in the world: the Louvre in Paris, the Met in New York, and the British Museum. And these institutions actually, because of their global collections, they speak to our shared humanity. They place things like the Elgin Marbles and the Benin Bronzes within that sort of wider global context where we can chart how civilizations develop differently and at different times. And that used to be understood, but now we are reducing everything to ethnicity and the nation state. And I find it very odd that these increasingly woke curators are essentially prioritizing nationalism over internationalism. And that seems to be a very odd argument for the left to be making. You know, the left were always usually people who hated nationalism. At least they do when it comes from the West. But when nationalism comes from non-Western countries, suddenly they're great enthusiasts for it.
So, Rafe, what should the British Museum's position on all this be? Should they just say no to any claim from any foreign government?
Absolutely. Well, the first thing to note, of course, is that this is all happening under the leadership of the most controversial and most powerful chairman of the British Museum in living memory, George Osborne, a man who seems hell-bent on giving away everything that this nation has. Firstly, opening us up to the Chinese and having their control of critical infrastructure and assets, then being the middleman to facilitate the sale of the Telegraph and the Spectator, 2 of our most important conservative publications, to an Abu Dhabi-backed company, and now again facilitating these secret negotiations. The fact is, what we should be doing is having a permanent exhibition at the British Museum, which celebrates the fact that it was actually Britain and France that saved the world's heritage in those regions. It was Britain and French Orientalists who rediscovered India's classical civilization, who discovered for the world that Buddha came from India, for example, preserved historical artifacts like temples and so forth, which were being completely neglected by the native populations. And it was the British and the French who built the museums that currently stand in those countries, where the vast majority of artifacts are actually to be found. The British Museum only has a tiny portion of the items that are actually in collections around the world. So we should be celebrating the fact that we've done all of this for human civilization, and the British Museum should be thought of as a British Museum of mankind, or a world museum, in other words.
Rafe, the argument goes that, yes, that might well have been true. It might well have been true that had the Elgin Marbles stayed on the Parthenon, on the Acropolis in Athens, they would have been blown up by the Ottomans and the gunpowder store as it was. And Britain might well have saved these items. And that's probably true of many of the items in the collection. But that was then, and this is now. And many people will argue, and do argue, that the way to preserve these items, we've done our bit, but now they should return back to their places of origin.
Well, that's simply not the case, because there's no guarantee that these items will be well preserved in many of these developing nations. I mean, we don't know the actual number of countries, or which countries are making these requests of the British Museum, but one of those that's often quoted are the Benin Bronzes of Nigeria. These, of course, are the Benin Bronzes were commissioned by the most brutal slave-owning regime in Africa, and they commemorate the slave-owning royals. Now, the Nigerian policy of the Nigerian government is to repatriate all of these Benin Bronzes and not put them on public display, but to return them to the descendant, the Oba, the king of the Benin, who was actually a descendant of these slave owners, taking them away from public view. Is that for the greater good? Surely the greater good is to have them seen by the largest number of people, and millions more people from around the world will see them in the British Museum. then say in Nigeria. Also, what we've known is that when Benin Bronzes went back to Nigeria and other items, within a few years, they often appeared on international sales markets.
Well, that's a very good point. Rafe, I'm sorry, we're going to have to end it there, but great to speak to you and get your view on all this. Rafe Heydel-Mankoo, that's it from us today.
It is.
That's it.
It's been lovely. It's been charming.
It's been charming.